see many people who are familiar to you. If we haven't met, I'm Rabbi David Lyon from Congregation Beth Israel, and I am just delighted to welcome everybody here. I want to thank Sylvia Wolff and Shirley Toomim for sponsoring the Wolff-Toomim Distinguished Lecture Series. I want to thank Carol Newberger for her remarkable support. I also want to thank David Scott for helping us to organize this exceptional program at such a timely moment in our nation, in our city.
Sit down.
As well, you have a few minutes to chat amongst yourselves, not audibly, but in the chat room to say hello to each other. And if you could mute, it would help us not only begin, but continue the program. And just on a selfish note, I want to encourage you to make a note in your own calendar for November 19th in the evening. Our regional director of APAC, Elias Eratosky, will join me in a conversation on current events in Israel and the Middle East. And it should be an engaging conversation given everything that's going on there and here as well. And I want to say hello to Dr. Stephen Klineberg, whom I've come to know in the community, and I'm delighted that he's here, and to our own Bobby Lapin, currently the president of the board of the Houston Jewish Federation and a past president of our own congregation. So welcome, enjoy this remarkable program, and I am simply going to turn it over to Bobby Lapin to continue our discussion.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Lyon. Good evening, everyone. Well, we are all in for quite a special treat tonight, I assure you, with our special guest, Stephen Klineberg. But before turning matters over to Steve, I also want to follow on Rabbi Lyon's comments and add as a personal note how genuinely honored I am to have been asked to help moderate this year's Wolff-Toomim Distinguished Lecture. It is no understatement, I assure you, to say that the Wolff and the Toomim names are rightly revered and beloved, not only in the Beth Israel community, but no less in the larger Jewish and greater Houston communities as well. Melvin Wolff and David Toomim, both of blessed memory, together with their life partners, Sylvia and Shirley, have really epitomized for so many of us the gold standard of leadership by infusing into the communities that they inhabited and led their energy, their wisdom, their philanthropy, and perhaps equally importantly, their message that all of us have a stake in our community and that none of us should be excused from doing what we can to take all that we've been given and to ensure that it passes to our children and our grandchildren from strength to strength. In the years since we've lost David and Melvin, Shirley and Sylvia have continued this legacy with no diminishment of energy or commitment, and we are all the better for it. And so I and we, all of us, say to you both, Sylvia and Shirley, and I know you're out there, thank you for all that you've done and continue to do to touch and to be there for so many families and lives in our community. And so how fitting is it that tonight we will all be gifted with the scholarship, the perspective, and the unique analysis of perhaps Houston's most premier sociologist and demographer, Dr. Stephen Klineberg. Steve is a professor emeritus at Rice, but he's also the founding director of Rice's Kinder Institute for Urban Research. And there's much that I could say. He's got a long CV, but that would be a waste of our time for me to go through all that. So I'll simply say this, that for 40 years now, almost 40 years now, I don't think any Houstonian has taken a more interesting or revealing pulse of the aspirations, the worries, the demographic patterns, and the beliefs of Harris County residents than has Stephen Klineberg. And for those of us that have actually been around in this city for that time, just think about the extraordinary changes that we've seen here in Houston over the past 4 decades. Well, here's the good news. You don't have to just think about it. We can now all read about it because this past summer, Simon & Schuster published Steve's book titled Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. This book chronicles this remarkable and unique volume of research, but it also teases out and begins to help explain its implications. I, of course, commend the book to you, but even better than that, tonight we all have the privilege of hearing directly from its author. So I'm going to field your questions in the chat section of the Zoom. Feel free as the lecture goes on to put your questions there, and I'll do my best when we get to the Q&A period to try to find those questions perhaps which seek some additional insights that we have not yet heard. So before getting to your questions, I'm going to ask Steve to share his reflections for maybe about 30 minutes or so, during which those few of you who previously may not have yet had the pleasure of hearing and learning from Steve will quickly come to understand why he has been the recipient of no fewer than 12 major teaching awards at Rice and has become really one of the most sought after speakers in the Houston community and beyond. And so, Steve, I see you there, and I say welcome to this year's Congregation Beth Israel Wolff-Toomim Distinguished Lecture Series. We are delighted and honored to have you, and the floor is now yours.
So much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Indulge me for a second. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint up here. Oh, there it is. I think it's going to work. Is that working? Is you all seeing this? Okay, wait. Oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you all again so much for what an honor to be here and be able to share with you what we think we learned now from 39 years of systematic surveys in Houston, Texas. So go back with me to 1982. Houston was booming. I was a young associate professor of sociology at Rice. This city had 1 million people who moved into Houston between 1970 and 1982. Greatest boom anyone had ever seen, brought about by the tenfold increase in the value of oil. 82% of all the primary sector jobs in Houston in 1980 were tied into the price of oil. Price of oil went from $3.20 per barrel in 1980 and 1970 to 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35. We were building and borrowing on the basis of $50 oil. This city was world famous for having imposed the least amount of controls on development of any city in the Western world. Saying was, who cares if it's ugly? So what if it smells? It's the smell of money. Come on down. So friends of mine just started a new survey organization. I said, let's get the students involved in doing a survey of how are people balancing this tremendous growth with growing concerns about traffic, pollution, crime. What kind of city are we building with all this affluence? One-time survey, never occurred to us to do it again. 2 months later, in May of 1982, the oil boom collapsed. The price of oil had gone to $3 to $35.50. We thought was going to go to $50, dropped down to $28 by the end of 1983. And 100,000 jobs were lost in this booming city. So my gosh, we better do this survey again. And so for 39 years, we've been taking a representative random sample of Harris County residents reached by random telephone numbers. Today, 50% landline, 50% cell phone, asking people with identical questions over the years. How do you see the world? What is happening in your life? And we have sat back and watched the world change. Houston went into major recession and then recovered into the restructured economy and the demographic revolution that has transformed the 21st century. Here are just, I want to touch on the 3 great themes that just emerged without my doing it, just hitting you in the face. A new economy where the good blue-collar jobs had disappeared. The big employers in Houston in the 1970s was Hughes Tool Company, Cameron Iron Works. You could drop out of high school with a strong right arm and expect to be able to make a middle-class wage. Those jobs had disappeared, growing inequalities across the board in Houston, predicated above all else on access to quality education. At the same time, a truly epic transformation in the ethnic composition of the Houston, the Texas, and the American population. This biracial southern city dominated by white men throughout all of its history has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the entire country. And instead of not caring about quality of life issues, a new awareness that quality of place is the attributes that turn Houston into a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. So we've been watching these 3 great transformations that underline what's happening across all of America. Finally got that book out called Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. So let's take a look at the economy. Here is the 30 years after World War II. The rising tide lifted all boats. The poorest 20% of Americans more than doubled their incomes in those 30 years after World War II. The richest 5% doubled theirs. This was a world of big business, big labor, big government. 38% of all the jobs in America in 1970 were tied into. I'm sorry. It was a world of big labor, where 38% of all the jobs in America were union jobs. The unions could negotiate with the corporations to ensure that workers shared in the prosperity of the companies, and the average American man, whatever his education, literally doubled his income in real terms between 1950 and 1970. And those were the years when we celebrated the stay-at-home housewife mother in suburbia. The average American woman between 1946 and 1964 gave birth to 3.6 children. And the baby boom was launched upon the land, preceded and followed by baby bust generations. So for 60 years, there's been this bulge going through the American system. The demographers talk about like a pig being swallowed by a python. Not very comfortable either for the pig or the python. The leading edge of those 76 million babies born in that incredible period after World War II, the leading edge turns 74 this year. And we are going to watch a literal doubling of the number of Americans over the age of 65 in the next 25 years. Every day, believe it or not, between now and 2030, day after day, 10,000 Americans will turn 65. And by 2030, the youngest of those 76 million will have turned 65, heading off into the proverbial sunset eventually, being replaced by a very different generation of Americans. It is an epic transformation, nowhere more clearly seen than in Houston, Texas. Here are, and I'll come back to that, of course, in just a minute. This is the 30 years after World War II. Here are the last 35 years, when virtually all the benefits of economic growth have gone to the richest 20%, most of that to the richest 5%, most of that to the richest 1%. A striking redistribution of earnings out of the hands of the poor and the middle class into the hands of the rich and the super rich in a way we have never seen before in American history, with the sole exception of 1928, just after the Roaring '20s and before the total collapse of the American economy in the Great Depression. What happened? Why did the economy change so profoundly? Two big things happened, and then a total failure for 40 years of our efforts to address these issues and ensure that people had opportunities to succeed in a new economy that is, number one, a global economy. Companies can produce goods anywhere now, sell them everywhere. If you are doing a job that I can train a third world worker to do, and I pay that third world worker $15 a day to do the job, I'm not going to pay you $15 an hour. And if you are doing a job that I can program a computer to do, we're just at the beginnings of the robotics revolution, I will soon be replacing your job with an intelligent machine. We are in a new world where education, always a nice thing to have, has become absolutely essential to a person's ability to find a job that can support a family in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. Here's one piece of evidence for this. This is the analysis by the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce of all the 91 million jobs that existed across America in 1973. 1/3 of those jobs you were eligible for as a high school dropout. Another 40% required no more than high school. 75% of all the jobs in America in the 1970s required high school or less. And here's what's happened to the jobs in America since then. And by 2020, by the end of this year, the estimate is 65% of all the jobs that will exist in America will require education beyond high school. Not necessarily 4 years of college, but 1 or 2 years in a community college to acquire the technical skills that connect you to the jobs of the 21st century. If you drop out, if you have a high school degree and no more in America today, and you don't have special skills as an artist or performer or an athlete, and you just say, put me to work, America, you're going to have trouble ever finding a job. And if you find a job, it will not pay you enough to support a family. The only way to improve the lot of the poor in the America of the 21st century is to invest in their skills. And it's a fundamental new understanding of what this economy now provides in terms of opportunities and challenges. And here's one of the surprises in our service. I always tell people, don't blame me. I'm asking these questions, and here are the answers. And here's one set of sea change that has occurred. We asked, starting in the 1990s, which of these statements comes closest to your opinions about the public schools in Houston? The schools have enough money, if it was used wisely, to provide a quality education, or the schools will need significantly more money in order to provide a quality education, if it was used wisely, right? That's what we all believe. There's plenty of money there being spent, it's being wasted, and that's what people said to us in the 90s. 55% saying the schools have all the money they need, and only 38 and 37% saying more money will be needed. During the first decade of the 21st century, it was a 50-50 split, so we sort of stopped asking the question, came back 10 years later, and now 55% in 2018. Came back to, in this year's survey, 55% to just 39%, saying the schools will need significantly more money. We are a different folk today. We understand those realities differently today than we did 10 or 15 years ago. Here was another one of the surprises. He said, are you in favor or opposed to increasing local taxes in order to provide universal preschool education for all children in Houston? And again, it started a question with increasing local taxes. No, stop. And to our surprise, in 2018, 67% of the respondents said they were in favor, 40% strongly in favor, only 30% opposed to increasing local taxes to provide universal preschool education. Came back in 2020, and it was now 70% in favor and only 28% opposed. What's striking here is, of course, the general public is correct on this. One of the moments of truth in American education is third grade reading. If you're not reading at the third grade level in third grade, you are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And the single most powerful predictor whether you can read at the third grade level is, did you start kindergarten ready to learn to read? And rich kids in Houston start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. And that gap continues to expand and is a central challenge as we go forward in the 21st century. The brain is growing by 60% between the ages 0 and 5. That's when all the synapses are forming. Best return on investment you can make is investing in preschool education. It is the great challenge. And the gap between rich and poor starts right there. And the central challenge is improving access to quality education from birth to college, from cradle to career. And it's the reason why there is so much inequality in Houston. I just want to give you a few examples of questions in the last couple of surveys. We said, supposing you had a $400 emergency, I had to come up with $400 to meet an emergency expense. How would you deal with that situation? Would you be able to pay for it out of savings? Would you need to borrow it? Or would you not be able to come up with $400 to meet an emergency expense? And in the survey in 2019, almost 40%, 39% said they could not come up with $400, living on the edge. And this was before the pandemic hit with the tremendous greater vulnerabilities of African Americans and Latinos to the loss of decent jobs and the pandemic that has so deeply affected the inequalities even further. Houston has the greatest medical complex in the world in the Texas Medical Center. 100,000 people work at the medical center, 39 different institutions, greatest place if you get sick, this is where you want to be. Houston has the greatest medical complex in the world. And Houston has the highest percentage of children without health insurance of any major city in America. 1/4 of all the respondents in our survey this year said they and their family had no health insurance whatsoever. 1/3 are living on full household incomes over the year of less than $37,500. 35% had problems, they said, paying for the groceries to feed their families during the past year. 35% said they had a problem paying for housing. Deep inequalities, deep vulnerabilities in one of the richest cities in America. And it's a powerful reflection of the central challenge. And again, the public seems to be shifting in their understanding of these issues. We've always believed in America, if you were poor, it's because you weren't trying hard enough, you didn't have the right values. This is a land of opportunity, anyone can make it. Government has no role to play, or very minimum role in our beliefs. And we've been watching these shifts occur, subtle but real. Agree or disagree, the government should take action to reduce income differences between rich and poor in America, went from 45 to 61% in the most recent survey. Government should see to it that everyone who wants to work and find a job, 69, 64 to 79% this year. Do you think most people who receive welfare benefits are really in need of help, or are they taking advantage of the system? The percent saying they're really in need of help went from 31 to 47%. Are you in favor or opposed to federal health insurance to cover the medical costs of all Americans? Subtle but real, going from 60 to 72%. Consistent, increasing recognition that we all collectively have a major responsibility to address the inequalities and provide greater opportunities for success in the America of the 21st century. Theme number 1, growing inequalities across the board in the city, state, and country, predicated above all else on access to quality education. Theme number 2, this truly remarkable, fundamental, irreversible transformation in the ethnic composition of the Houston, the Texas, and the American population. Why here? Why now? Why is this happening? Here's a quick history lesson. This is the number of documented immigrants coming to America in each of the decades from the 1820s through 2010. So, the story of our lifetimes is that between 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and 1965, between 1492 and 1965, 82% of all the human beings on the face of this earth who came to American shores, 82% came from Europe. Another 12% were Africans originally brought here as slaves to serve the Europeans. There was a handful of Chinese and Japanese working as farmers or laborers in California and Hawaii. This nation was an amalgam of European nationalities throughout all of its history, deliberately so. We were operating under the last 40 years of that period, between 1924 and 1965, under one of the most viciously racist laws the US Congress ever passed, the National Origins Quota Act. And it came out of the great anti-immigrant racist backlash that accompanied the last great wave of immigration when 15.9 million immigrants poured into America between 1890 and 1914. Coming from Europe, but not coming from Northern Europe. They were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and they weren't Protestants, they were Catholics and Jews, and they had no history of democracy, and they come in and take our jobs and destroy our country. And in 1924, we enacted this incredible act that said, all right, from now on, only Northern Europeans will be allowed to come to this country. Here's the new science of psychology and the IQ test to declare in the act, science has proven that there are 3 subspecies of the white race. The Nordics, who are biologically and intellectually superior to the Alpines, who in turn are superior to the Mediterraneans, and all of them are superior to the Jews and the Asians. And the law codified the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan in 1906, to declare in the act, Asians are an inferior subspecies of humanity, ineligible from ever becoming American citizens, and Asians were banned entirely from coming to America. The law of the land through the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. You can see what happens to immigration. It plummets. That's, of course, the Great Depression in the 1930s, followed by World War II, the terrible aftermath of World War II. We thought immigration had ended, that racist law could not survive the shifts of consciousness of the civil rights movements. Jack Kennedy's assassination. Kennedy is one of the great champions of immigration. The last book published after he was assassinated was entitled A Nation of Immigrants, a celebration of how much immigration had brought to America throughout its history. And in 1965, Congress changed the law, partly in tribute to him, thinking nothing much is going to change. We're just going to get rid of this racist law. We'll give every country recognized by the UN 20,000 visas a year, regardless of their ethnicity, but we're going to continue the hallmark of American immigration policy, which is family reunification. If you're the father, mother, sister, brother, son, or daughter of an American citizen, you can come to the head of the line. Therefore, said Congress, we think immigration has ended, but if it hasn't, we're going to give preference to those who are already here, so nothing should change in our immigration, in our ethnic composition. Then it added another provision. It said, well, if you're a professional of exceptional ability, or if you have skills that are demonstrably needed in short supply, you too can come to the head of the line. And in its debates in the 1950s, Congress was saying, we need to open the door for some more British doctors, some more German engineers. It never occurred to anyone that there were going to be African doctors, Indian engineers, Chinese computer programmers, Filipino nurses, who would be able for the first time in the 20th century to come to America. The law was changed in 1965 to be called one of the great inadvertent acts that the U.S. Congress has ever passed, in a body known, of course, for its inadvertent acts and its unintended consequences. We thought nothing would change. Everything changed. During the 1960s, 3.5 million immigrants came to America. Only 38% were from Europe. 1970s, 5 million came, only 18% were Europeans. 1980s, 90s, and 2000s, 10 million immigrants per decade have been coming into America. 88% coming from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. And the United States, that throughout all of our history had been an amalgam of European nationalities, is becoming a microcosm of the world. The first nation in the history of the world that can say we are a free people and we come from everywhere. And it's a truly remarkable change. The same moment as the American economy is becoming fully integrated with a single global world economic system, America, a microcosm of all the world's peoples, all the world's ethnicities. Immigration is, of course, network driven. You go where you, I'm sorry, going the wrong way here. You go where you know people. And New York City is, of course, the great immigration capital in terms of sheer numbers, followed by Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, followed right after Chicago by Houston, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and then San Diego, Dallas, Boston, Atlanta, spreading now to every city and town across America. No city has been transformed as fully, as completely, as suddenly, as irreversibly as Houston, Texas. This city, throughout all of our history, was a biracial southern city dominated and controlled in an automatic, taken for granted way by white men. And in the space of the last 35 years, has become the single most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the entire country. Here are the census figures. This is all for Harris County in 1960. There were 1.243 million of us living in Harris County. 74% of us were Anglos, 20% African Americans, just 6% Hispanics, less than 0.5% were Asians. This was our biracial world. During the oil boom years of the 60s and 70s, it was Anglos pouring into Houston. And by 1980, Houston had become the fourth largest city in America, having surpassed Philadelphia, still an overwhelmingly Anglo city. After the oil bust of 1982, the Anglo population of Harris County stopped growing. And all the growth of this, the most rapidly growing city in America, has been the influx of African Americans, Latinos, and Asians. Here are the last 3 decades of the census figures. You can see the Anglo population stabilizes in 1990 and then drops slightly. African American population keeps pace with the population as a whole, fueled by African and Jamaican immigration, fueled by the great remigration of middle-class African Americans who had gone to northern cities in the 20s and 30s, coming back to southern cities, Atlanta first, Houston second, African American population keeping pace, and surging populations of Latinos and Asians. And the latest figures from the census, Harris County today is now 42% Hispanic, 31% Anglo, 19% African American, 8% Asian. No city has been transformed as rapidly as that. Just think how different the story of Houston would have been had we not become a magnet for the new immigration of the last 30 years. Houston would have lost population. We would have the same fate as other major American cities across the country that are losing their status as major cities because for 35 years they have stopped growing. Wonderful cities they may be, but no longer at the forefront of the American urban growth. Philadelphia, Baltimore, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Buffalo. And the state of Houston is one of the most vibrant, rapidly growing cities in America, tremendous entrepreneurial economy, last city to go into recession, first one to come out, purely because of the tremendous energy, vitality, commitment to hard work of immigrants pouring into the city from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean. No city has benefited more from immigration than Houston, Texas. And again, just think how different the story of Houston would have been had we not become a magnet for the urban growth of America in the last 35 years. Here's a quick way to envision this. This is Harris County in 1980. There were 1,253 census tracts in Harris County. And in blue are all the census tracts in the 1980 census that had majority Anglo populations. In red are the census tracts that had majority African American. That's the African American corridor, the 3rd Ward and the 5th Ward. Along the ship channel was the Segundo Barrio where the Latinos were, and then a few places around the Beltway in that olive color with no majority. Harris County 1980. Here's Harris County 1990. Here we are in 2000, and here it is in 2010. Isn't that incredible? No one consulted with me before all these people came. Houston, without ever having planned this, finds itself at the forefront of the demographic transformation occurring across all of America, again, nowhere more clearly seen than in Houston, Texas. And here's why we claim that Houston is the most ethnically diverse major metropolitan area in the country. How do you measure the ethnic diversity of a population? 2 standard ways. One is, what's the percentage of Anglos? Fewer Anglos, more diverse. A better, richer measure is what's called the entropy index. How close does a population come to 1/4 Asian, 1/4 Latino, 1/4 African American, 1/4 Anglo? And by that measure, Houston just beats out New York for the crown of the most ethnically diverse metropolitan area in the country. Here are the other 7 large metro areas. And you can see every one of these metro areas that has been succeeding in the last 25 years is succeeding largely because it has attracted the diversity of the new urban growth of the last 35 years. But Los Angeles has too few African Americans. Chicago has too many Anglos. Miami has too few Asians. Houston is where the 4 communities meet in greater balance, greater equality. All of us minorities, all of us called on to build something that has never existed before in human history. A truly successful, inclusive, equitable, united, multi-ethnic society made up of all the peoples, all the ethnicities, all the religions of the world, gathered together in one remarkable place. It is a story of Houston in the 21st century. Whether we would have chosen it or not, there it is. That's who we are and will be as we go forward. And it's not just numbers, it's also ages. So this brings me back to the baby boom discussion. So let's see, I've got babies on the right, I've got old people on the left. I've got 12 different age categories from under the age of 5 to 75 years old and older. Here is where, somewhat to my chagrin, is where the Anglos are in Harris County, Texas today. Ladies and gentlemen, the baby boom. It's not until you reach people in Harris County over the age of 63 that the majority of folks are still Anglos. And at each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets, percentage of African Americans, Asians, and above all Latinos surges. Here's where everybody else is in Harris County, Texas today. So this is a powerful picture of Houston's present and future, of everybody in Harris County, not inner city Houston, not HISD, of everybody in all of Harris County who are under the age of 20, who will be the workers and voters and citizens and taxpayers of Houston in the 21st century, of everybody under the age of 20 today. 51% are Latinos, 19% are African Americans, 9% are Asians, 21% of everybody under 20 is Anglo. So it's a fair statement to make that how Houston navigates this transition, it's a safe statement to make about Houston's future, that if Houston's African American and Latino young people are unprepared to succeed in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century, it is difficult to envision a prosperous future for Houston. That 70% is who we will be as the 21st century unfolds. And the other point to make is that this is a done deal. Close the borders, build your fence, close off America, round up those 10 million people you think are here illegally and send them wherever you think they're supposed to go. Seal off America so not another refugee or immigrant ever again sets foot on these shores. 63-year-old Anglos are not going to be making a whole lot more babies. We'll do the best we can. We'll work on it every chance we get. You can go to the bank on this, right? No conceivable force in the world is going to stop Houston or Texas or America from becoming more African American, more Asian, more Latino, and less Anglo as the 21st century unfolds. Nothing in the world can stop that. So the only question our generation has been given is, okay, how do we make this work? How do we ensure that this diversity becomes a tremendous asset that can be as we position ourselves in the global economy, the gateway to the global marketplace, and make sure it doesn't end up tearing us apart and becoming a major liability, reducing rather than enhancing our competitiveness in the global economy? Much depends on how this generation speaks of this remarkable convergence of the two forces that have transformed the 21st century in our lifetimes. A new economy where education has become critical, and a demographic revolution. So this is Houston today. Here's America today. So the same thing, babies on the left, old people on the right, 12 different categories, same pattern. The aging of Anglos, which is one of the big stories coming out of that incredible broad-based prosperity of the 30 years after World War II. And this is still an overwhelmingly Anglo country, but those patterns are there in the actuarial tables. And in fact, 6 months after we got this data from the census, they said, okay, all of our estimates now tell us across the entire country of everybody under the age of 9 across America, the majority are now African American, Latino, and Asian. And you want to know what America will look like in 2050? Let's assume no immigration. So we'll just go by the actuarial tables. Here's what they say America will look like in 2050. So this is very close to Houston. It's actually almost identical to Texas today. It is fair to say that this is where the American future, for better or worse, is going to be worked out. By 2050, all of America will look like Houston looks today. We are there first. We are called on to be a model for what all of America can be as the transformations of Houston take place across the entire country. How we manage this diversity will be enormously significant, not just for the Houston future, but for the American future. This is where you can see the American future emerging. And we've been interested in asking, how are people dealing with these questions? Let me just show you a few of those, and I'll get on. The great danger of inviting someone who's just written a book is, of course, I could talk for hours about all these things. So let me quickly take a look at how have people changed in their views of these issues. So here are just a few examples of questions we asked in our survey this year and in few previous years. Are you in favor, do you agree or disagree refugees who are in danger in their home countries should always be welcome in Houston? 64%, to our surprise, in 2016 agreed with that statement. Then it went to 75, and in the survey this year, 77% saying we should always welcome refugees into Houston. We've asked people, here's a 10-point scale where 1 means very negative feelings, 10 means very favorable feelings. Where on this scale would you indicate your feelings about undocumented immigrants? And the percent saying, giving us ratings of 7 to 10 on the scale about undocumented immigrants went from 24% to 49%. Then we asked, what about Muslims or followers of Islam? 35, 41, 45, 60% in the survey this year. So this is everybody. What happens if you just look at US-born Anglos? So here are 3 questions we asked up until 2019. We're going to ask again in 2021. Do you agree or disagree? I'm sorry, this is one that said, do you think that do immigrants contribute more to the American economy than they take, or do they take more than they contribute? Moving back and forth because it's a small sample, but unmistakable direction from 30 to 48% saying immigrants contribute more to the American economy than they take. Again, this is US-born Anglos in Harris County. Do you think increasing immigration into America today mostly strengthens American culture or mostly threatens American culture? Mostly strengthens American culture, went from 33 to 54 and 49%. And do you think Houston's increasing ethnic diversity will become a source of great strength for the city or a growing problem? The percent saying it will be a source of great strength went from 59 to 70%. So then we can ask the question, what's causing this? Is this people changing their minds about immigration over these years? Or is it what sociologists call cohort secession? Is it that younger Anglos are coming into the world with different views than older Anglos? And it's a little bit of both, but it's primarily cohort secession. And here's how we tested this. This is again looking just at US-born Anglos in Harris County who were born in the 1960s, the baby boom generation, those born in the 1970s, what's called Generation X, and those born in the 1980s, the beginnings of the millennial generation, how they answered these questions when all of them were aged 25 to 35. And here's what you find. This is what sociologists call a robust finding. Immigrants immigration into this country mostly strengthens American culture. Immigrants generally contribute more to the American economy than they take. U.S. should admit more of the same number of legal immigrants in the next 10 years as we admit in the last 10 years. Millennials are coming of age with a totally different sense of what this immigration looks like and how we should feel about it than us older Anglos. And here's one other kind of fun example of what's going on here. We asked all the Anglos in these surveys over the years, have you ever been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who was not Anglo? And of Anglos under 40, 58, 61% said, thank you for asking. Yes, indeed, I have. Here it is for Anglos, 40 to 60. And here it is for us older Anglos. I'm afraid the hearts are going to get a little smaller here. A powerful reminder that we older Anglos grew up in a different world. The world of the 1960s and 70s was a different place than the world of the 1990s and 2000s. There's a law of human nature that says what I am familiar with feels right and natural, what I'm unfamiliar with feels unnatural and somehow not quite right. Every question we ask about comfort with diversity, support for immigration, is predicted among Anglos, not by education, not by gender, but by age. Younger Anglos taking for granted what we older Anglos are still struggling to accept. So I tell people, you gotta be gentle with us old Anglos. Big change, but we're all changing. And what is striking is to see how rapidly each new generation is coming along, taking these transformations for granted, falling in love with each other. We are asking this question, gets a little bit at it, watching people making multiracial babies. 1/3 of all the marriages in America involving Asian in the last 3 years, 1/3 involved a non-Asian. In Houston, of all the married US-born Latinos, 28% are married to non-Latinos. There's been a 750% increase in black-white marriages. We are moving into a different transracial world. The great challenge for the future of Houston and America is not so much an ethnic divide as it is a class divide. That's going to be the central question for this country and for this city as we go forward in the 21st century. So theme number 2, this remarkable transformation and the growing embrace of the diversity in each of the years. The people who have the most experience with the diversity embrace it the most, and that's again a very positive sign as we go. Third theme, quality of place. If Houston's going to make it in the 21st century, it needs to become a destination of choice, a place where the best and the brightest people in America working at the cutting edge of knowledge will say, I want to live in Houston, Texas. The resource of the knowledge economy is housed between the ears of the best and the brightest people in America who can live anywhere. And suddenly, quality of life issues, never important for Houston in the old days. Who cares if it's ugly? Quality of life issues have become central to the pro-growth agenda for Houston in the 21st century. This city has no prayer of being a major city in the 21st century economy if it is perceived by people outside Houston to be not only flat and hot for much of the year, but also ugly and dangerously polluted. And the business community knows that. And we've been making enormous progress in building a much more attractive and interesting city. Here's why we flood. This is the 11 major bayous in Houston. Those bayous, this reminds me, it gives me a chance to talk about one of the great transformative events, I think, in Houston's history. In 2012, the citizens of the city of Houston voted to tax ourselves $100 million, floating a $100 million bond to be matched by $130 million in private monies to take the 9 major bayous in Houston. The bayous that were concretized in the cheapest possible way by the Army Corps of Engineers to serve as drainage ditches for our flooding problems in the 1970s and 80s. That's what we did down here. No one thought of these as amenities of any value. We got these floods, we got these crazy creeks. Let's straighten them out, get the water out of here. We voted to build 150 miles of linear parks along all 9 of the major bayous of Houston, so that by 2021, when the Bayou Greenways Initiative is completed, 60% of everybody who lives within the city of Houston will be within walking distance of a bayou trail. And Houston will become one of the greenest cities in America. That would have been inconceivable 25 or 30 years ago, or even 10 or 15 years ago. This is a city reinventing itself, rethinking what it needs to be successful in the 21st century. And it's also why we flood. And so flooding, of course, obviously since Harvey has been a central preoccupation. So here are a couple of questions we asked. 6 months after Harvey, and then a year and a half, and then 2.5 years afterwards, do you agree or disagree? It's almost certain that the Houston area will experience more severe storms during the next 10 years compared to the past 10. This is not an aberration. This is a new reality. And 77% today said, yes, it's almost certain. And we said, well, how are you in favor opposed to prohibiting any additional construction in areas of Houston that have repeatedly flooded? 71% dropping to 56%. We don't like government regulations telling us what we should do on our property, and to our surprise, came up to 65% in the survey this year, prohibiting additional construction in areas of Houston that repeatedly flooded. And part of what's going on here is a sea change in our understanding of global warming. So here are 2 questions we've asked over the years. How serious a threat is climate change? As you say, it's a very serious problem, somewhat serious, or not much of a problem. The percent saying in Houston, it's a very serious problem. Went from 39, 42, 46, 52, came back this year, 51%, saying it's a very serious problem. And then even more striking, do you think climate change is mainly caused by human activities or by normal climate cycles? And here we are in the oil and gas capital of the world, the percent saying climate change is due to us and to our human activities. Went from 48 to 54 to 58 to 61 to 65, came back this year, 69%. A new reality, a new perception of the world we live in is one that we are affecting by the burning of fossil fuels, and we need to lead the transition into the new energy future, figure out how to capture and sequester the carbon to ensure that we can burn these fossil fuels without creating a real danger. Final thing I want to point to is that Houston is, by some measures, one of the most spread out, least dense, most automobile dependent cities in all of America. Here is the city of Houston. It covers 600 square miles and has 2.2 million people living in it. 600 square miles. You know how big that is? You could put inside the city limits of Houston, Texas, simultaneously, I kid you not, the cities of Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Philadelphia. Those 4 cities cover the same geographical space as the city of Houston, and they contain 5.5 million people. The city of Houston contains 2.2 million. One of my friends several years ago said, what's striking about Houston is almost wherever you are, you think you're at the edge of town. You got all this openness all over the place. And if you go out then to the greater Houston metropolitan area, the CMSA of Houston, here's Harris County. Excuse me 1 second, I've got to let my cat out. Okay, thanks for waiting. This is Harris County, of course. This is Fort Bend County. I didn't get to mention. Fort Bend County, we think, is the most ethnically diverse county on this planet. Fort Bend County today is 21% Asian, 20% African American, 24% Latino, 33% Anglo. Nowhere do you come that close to 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. It's the story of Houston. And then meanwhile, of course, by some measures, one of the most Republican counties in the country is Montgomery County up in the north. So we encompass a whole bunch of folks. But this greater Houston metropolitan area has 6.5 million people in it and covers 10,000 square miles. 10,000 square miles. That is almost as large as the entire state of Massachusetts, and considerably larger than the state of New Jersey. This is the blob that ate East Texas. Houston was built on a crummy little bayou, 50 miles from any natural barrier in any direction. No mountains, no forests, no rivers, a developer's dream, built by, for, and on behalf of the automobile, made possible by air conditioning, and we spread everywhere. And we've created a civilization totally predicated on the automobile, at least historically. And so we've been asking people in our surveys, if you could live any way you wanted in Houston, what would you prefer? Here's my last set of things I'm going to show you. What kind of neighborhood would you like to live in? A single family residential area, which is what most of us are provided with in Houston, or an area with a mix of developments, including homes, shops, and restaurants, and it's pretty much a 50-50 split. And we said, what kind of home would you like to live in? A single family home with a big yard where you would need to drive just about everywhere you want to go, or a smaller home in a more urbanized area within walking distance of shops and workplaces. And again, a 50-50 split. And what's striking here, I think, is that this is not anti-sprawl or anti-big houses. This is a reflection that we are a different folk than we were back in the 1960s and 70s when we all went out to the suburbs and built this sprawling metropolis. In the census of 1970, 2/3 of all American families had children living at home. You have children at home, they need to be outside, they need big spaces, they need these new suburbs that are growing in the yards. Today, about 1/3 in the census thinks by the end of our count in 2020, no more than about 1 in 4 households in America will have children living at home. Another 1/4 will consist of individual persons living alone. We're trying to attract the creative class, the millennials. Sociologists talk about the millennial generation as the postponing generation. They seem to be in no rush to get married, to have babies, to turn us into grandparents. When they have babies, they're not going to have 3.6, they're going to have 1.4. And they don't want to be out in the suburbs or in the big open spaces. They want all the variety, walkability, diversity, bar hopping that only urban life can provide. And the fastest growing age segment of the entire population of America and of Houston, the fastest growing age segment are men and women over the age of 80, growing faster than any other segment of the American population. And we have not seen anything yet. As the baby boom turning 74 this year moves rapidly into senior status, I'm not sure I want all those 85-year-olds having to drive everywhere in Houston, Texas. So we are indeed a different folk, and we are rethinking across the board, what kind of city do we want to build? What will work best? How will we respond to the shifting preferences and understandings of Houstonians as we build the Houston that will be a model for America in the 21st century? So concluding notes, right, that we've seen significant changes over the years in area residents' responses, these major issues. Survey participants increasingly acknowledge the need to improve the public schools, to redress the rising inequalities across the board, unmistakably calling for new initiatives to mitigate future storms, develop more walkable neighborhoods, clearly embracing Houston's burgeoning diversity, feeling more positive and comfortable with all the continuing immigration. Ready to support programs and initiatives today that they would not have supported nearly as strongly 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, a new understanding of who we are and where we're going. And the real question, I think, for the Houston future is whether we can build, as business and civic leaders can build on those attitude changes to make the sustained commitments that will be needed for prosperity in this new era of economic, demographic, and technological transformation. As the region copes with the triple whammy that we're right in the middle of right now, of a health pandemic, of an economic shutdown, of a collapse of oil prices in Houston, and growing concern and awareness of racial injustice and systemic racism and the terrible inequalities that are increasing. As we deal with all those immediate shorter term interests, it's good to be reminded of the broader, longer term challenges that we face as we work to build the Houston of the 21st century. So I tell people, stay tuned. We're going back in the field in February of 2021 with a full year of having experienced this pandemic. Wonderful opportunity to systematically measure how have we been changed by this last year, and how are we continuing our development and moving toward the understanding of a different world. So here are, if you're interested in more data and information, please visit kinder.rice.edu and download the 2020 survey report. Pick up the book, Prophetic City. Best place is Brazos Bookstore, but you can also get it from Amazon. It's still relevant, but getting obsolete because Houston is changing so rapidly. But it was a wonderful opportunity to just sort of put Houston on the map. This may be the most interesting, the most consequential city in America. And it's the one that's least studied and least understood outside of Houston. So my hope was that the books will help change some of that and help people realize what an interesting place we live in and how important what happens in Houston is going to be for the rest of America and indeed the world. Thank you all very, very much. And you stop there. Bobby, open it to anybody ask any questions. We have some room for discussion. I'll turn this off now and come back to.
Well, Steve, thank you. I mean, I now know what it's like to feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose, given the volume of information that you just gifted us with, and what a remarkable collage of information. And thank you so much for that. Honestly, I think we could probably spend the short period we have for questions on any one of those slides, but let me do my best to try to filter out some of the questions that have come in over the chat and see if we can get a few in before we have to call it quits here. And there's one that several people have asked, and I think is a natural question. And that is, it really picks up, Stephen, where you left off when you said we're about to have the opportunity to measure the effect of this most unique pandemic. I think if you could confirm for us, and I think you can, that the data that you just shared with us was all pre-pandemic.
Yes.
And so as you look into your crystal ball, and knowing now, having had 39 years of some sense of trends here, where do you think the assumptions are going to be most affected by the pandemic? What changes are you looking to see, and what will be those implications for those changes?
Okay, so you're right. The last interview that we conducted for the 2020 survey was on March 12th. And on March 16th, the pandemic hit Houston. That was the first time, the bars were closed and the restaurants were shut down. So going back in the field in February and early March of 2021, and we can get a really systematic measure of what's happened. It's clear, one thing that's obviously going to happen is one of the questions we ask every year is, how would you rate job opportunities in Houston? Excellent, good, fair, or poor. 69% in our survey in 2021, in 2020, said job opportunities are excellent or good. I don't think you're going to get 69% saying that in today's economic experiences. We're going to see a more flexibility in how people want to live in the city, because we now know that Zoom works. We don't have to go into the office every day. We can live further away, and it's going to be interesting to see what's happening there. My sense is that these bigger trends that we've been looking at over these years that we were just talking about, those are not likely to change. We're not going to. But there's now more sensitivity, perhaps, to racial injustice and to systemic racism in Houston and America than it was in previous years. So it's going to be one of the things that's such fun about these surveys is that you never know what you're going to find. And I have this powerful sense when the data come in, I'm the only one in the world who has seen this, the new data, and then trying to, okay, what does this tell us? And is it consistent? And does it connect? And who changed and who didn't? And what does this tell us about where we're going? And I have some hunches for some of the things. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out and to have that opportunity. And the other thing, just very quickly, is I think I mentioned at the beginning, I did not plan to do this with my life. This was a one-time survey. I get unfairly credited with having recognized how important and interesting Houston would be to follow. And then, as I mentioned, the incredible economic prosperity, 1 million people moving into the city, 1,380 people a week suddenly collapsing. So I had to do it again. And then the result was, wow, who knew that Houston would turn out to be maybe the most interesting city in America?
So as you know, we have a Jewish group that is here watching tonight. So I feel, and some of the questions that are coming in are asking what we know about Jewish demography.
Right.
And I'll point out that for those who don't know, that 4 years ago in 2016, the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston conducted the latest demographic study and concluded that about 65,000 or so Jews in Houston live in about 26,000 Jewish households. So roughly 1.4%, just
Right.
1.4%.
That's all. That's just what we get in our surveys. Not
Yeah. So that's the percentage of Houston households that are Jewish households. And one of the questions that's come in is there any conclusion that we could draw from that? Why is Houston's Jewish population so tiny and compared to what you might see in some of the other cities that you talked about?
Right, certainly up in the East. Yeah, it's, a big part of it is that the Jewish community was growing very, very rapidly during the 60s and 70s in Houston. That was when, and basically followed the overall Anglo pattern. And then after 1982, stopped growing. And it's grown to some degree, of course, but it partakes of that broader Anglo experience that has happened across the board. I got involved early on with the Federation in doing demographic surveys. It was really interesting to see the tremendous increase in the numbers of Jews who were in Houston in the 1980s, and then how it stayed. And then the other thing is, of course, we're all getting older. And so the question, do we need more elementary schools for Jews, or do we need more old folks homes for Jews? And the answer is probably the old folks. But a wonderful population, of course, but enormously kicking, playing way beyond its weight in terms of the importance and the role that it plays, with 1.2% of the population really transforming and helping to build the city in extraordinary ways.
So let me try to amalgamate a couple of different questions that are coming in into one, because one of the big themes that you left us with just a moment ago is that our community, far from fearing what you term as Houston's burgeoning diversity, is really embracing it. And yet, in the wake of the George Floyd murder and aftermath, when we see how COVID has disproportionately affected minority communities, and now we've, of course, emerged from a pretty hotly contested election, which some might argue encourage more tribalism among ethnic communities, it almost seems more natural for ethnic communities to instinctively perhaps want to pull inward a bit and to circle the wagons. So the question is this, Steve: how do we as a Houston community do our best to keep these fissures from forming? And would it be most successful to have it achieved top down from leadership and business and political leadership top down? Or are we more likely to be successful continuing this embrace of diversity bottom up from what might be termed the grassroots of our civil society? How do you see it?
Yeah, that's another great question. What I see, as I mentioned, is what we're dealing with. What is a great challenge for the future is not so much an ethnic divide as it is a class divide. Excuse me. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, the one demographic in America that has been suffering the most, the one demographic whose life expectancy has dropped, living shorter lives today than they did 10 years ago, dying of what the economists call the diseases of despair, drug addiction, alcoholism, obesity. It is white men with high school educations or less living in small town and rural areas. That was a big part of the Trump support. And in a sense of, my father worked in the coal mines, my grandfather had a great job in the steel mills. Where are my jobs? And our failure to invest in their education, provide the opportunities that they needed, and a sense that America is passing them by and just paying attention to blacks and Latinos and paying no attention to poor whites. That's an interesting, powerful part of the challenge. That's, again, it's a class divide in all communities. We're watching a growing middle class and a growing underclass in all four major communities, predicated above all else on quality education. So that's, I think, a big part of the, and it's not just education, of course, it's all the things that you need and that we middle-class parents provide for our kids to support them in education. Access to quality health care, good food and not food deserts, and parents who can be home when the kids need them the most. All the things that poor folks in Houston have enormous difficulty in providing. I'm on a shtick now to tell every business in Houston and every church in Houston, every business ought to adopt a school, adopt one school. And just and connect to them, to those, and maybe once a month, let some of your workers mentor a kid in that school, in that public school, and help them in all the ways of navigating that we middle-class folks know so well how to do. Every church ought to have after-school and preschool programs, reaching out to kids, because that's how we're going to be able to build a community that can succeed in the 21st century. The great danger is that this growing gap between rich and poor, growing concentration of opportunity in rich families and growing dearth of opportunities in poor families is the great danger for the future of America, I think. And that's why I end the book saying the jury is out. Are we going to be making the long-term investments that these times demand of us if we're going to build a city, a state, or a country that can succeed in this new world?
All right, let's talk about another long-term investment that needs to be made. We Houstonians love our cars.
Yes.
And you've talked, I know you've talked a great deal about the increased population. I know in years past, you've talked about how traffic was nearer to the top of people's concerns, et cetera. We've invested now in some light rail. We've continue to invest in metro. And yet there's a great fear, and this comes up in a couple of the questions, of our turning into another Los Angeles, or turning into another area, a large city where the infrastructure to manage and to move all these people has not been kept in place. So give us a sense based on what you hear and what you see of how are we doing in that regard, and does the future bode well or ill in terms of the ability for us to continue to freely move around the city and therefore prosper as we always have?
Okay, another great question. It's a whole new story, a whole new world to talk about. Houston is, I say, the most spread out, least dense major city in America, right? Houston is actually not a city and suburb. It's the epitome of what sociologists call the MCMR, the multi-centered metropolitan region. There are 8 to 10 centers of concentration, like Sugarland and the Woodlands and the Galleria that are larger than downtown San Diego, and that have this sort of. So the hope for Houston is that we can build density within those small areas and build connections between. We cannot solve our traffic problems anymore by building more roads. First of all, there's no place to build those roads anymore. We already see that with the I-45 expansion problems. But it's also that someone wants to say that trying to solve your traffic problems by building more roads is like trying to deal with your weight problem by buying a bigger pair of pants. Right? It doesn't do much to solve the problem. It gives you a little bit of relief for a little while. And we go in so many different directions. So it's very tough to build a transit system that can cover the expanse of the state of Massachusetts. I mean, that's what's so remarkable in this world. So what we are heading toward is a much greater variety of different ways of getting around. Cars, Uber and Lyft are going to become increasingly important. Biking will become more and more safe and accessible. People are going to be able with Zoom and to go back into normality. We can live further away from where we work and go in more, less often with less driving. We can go at different times during the day. I can Zoom in the morning and come in early afternoon when it's much less. So there are things like that are going to be coming that will maintain mobility, but very different from a city totally dependent on the automobile, more so than almost any other city in America. Phoenix is the other city that comes very close. It's just everybody has to drive. And more you can see in Houston alternatives being developed. But it's going to be a variety. There won't be a single solution, be a whole variety of different ways. And transit is going to be important. Building the first ever in American high-speed rail between Houston and Dallas is going to do a lot to connect downtowns to each other by rail instead of by driving. So it's going to be very interesting to watch the next 15 to 20 years as all of this evolves.
Thank you. One of the, of course, several of your slides focused on this issue of how diverse Houston is, the 25, 25, 25, 25 break, and you talk about ethnic groups, but you speak of them, for example, you talk about Latinos. But we know that as Houston's population continues to grow, that even within those bands, even within those particular classifications, these are not monolithic ethnic communities. These are very diverse ethnic communities. And I think one of the lessons that we're all learning from the recent election.
Yes, absolutely right.
When you tend to group an ethnic community as being almost monolithic, Latino, Asian, et cetera, and you don't you don't look at the breakdown among them, that you really do so at your peril. So one of the questions that seems to be coming up here is, what are the implications of that? Is that a positive for Houston? And what are some of the issues that may arise as even the ethnic communities themselves become more stratified?
Yeah, again, great questions. I mean, 28 different cultures and religions among Asians, and obviously big difference between Cubans on the one hand and Mexican Americans on the other. And of course, we become a nation of immigrants again. I mean, the chart is just amazing, right? The last time it was like that was 1890, but nothing like how much we become a nation of immigrants. First generation immigrants tend to stay together, tend to speak the language, they tend to feel more comfortable with each other. Second generation become 100% American kids and connect and get to know each other and fall in love. And the real problem we have is these damn multi-ethnic kids. What are they? You know? Like, resource officers want to put people in nice, clear, separate categories, and it's well, that's another reason why I'm absolutely convinced we're not there yet. Still a deeply racist world we live in, but the real challenge is not going to be an ethnic divide. It's going to be a class divide, and that's going to happen, I think, across the board. And that's the rise now of the second generation is really striking. It's especially striking among Asians. We did three major surveys of the Asian population in Houston. In 1995, only 8% of all the Asian adults in our survey were U.S. born, and 92% were immigrants. In 2002, the second survey, it was 15%. And in 2011, the last time we did the survey, it was 32%. 1/3 of all the Asians back 10 years ago were 100% American kids, U.S. born, kids who are traditionally, and not entirely, but largely from upper middle class backgrounds, and people of color with deep connections to other ethnic communities in Houston that seem to me to be one of the ways by which we're going to build this successful multi-ethnic society, by more and more folks building and connecting. The thought is now 1/3 of all families with whites predominating, 1/3 of all Anglo families have at least one non-Anglo close relative. And that's something we're just watching begin to develop. So you're right. I think at some point, ethnicity will become totally irrelevant. It would make no sense. And people will have the same freedom that Anglos have today to decide, do I want to emphasize my Italian background or my Irish background or neither? You're going to have something of that happening among just about everybody. Am I African American? Am I Latino? Am I Anglo? And it's going to be a very interesting, again, piece of the new humanity that emerges out of places like Houston that are a microcosm of all the world's peoples. I mean, it's just a really remarkable kind of thing that, again, no one in Houston ever planned for or thought would be a nice idea. It is our destiny. It is where we are. That's who we have become. And it is a remarkably, it turns out, wonderful thing. I mean, it's just wonderful food, wonderful restaurants, fascinating fiestas and festivals, much more interesting city than we ever would have imagined that has come out of this. And that's why I think Houstonians, embrace this diversity and see it as hey, I wouldn't have chosen this and never occurred, but this is really fun and interesting. And you go to a place like Rice. When I first went to Rice as a young assistant professor in the 1970s, 80% of everybody at Rice was Anglo, 70% were Texans, right? Today in Rice University in Harris County, 41% are Anglos, one tenth are foreign students studying there. I mean, it's just a totally different kind of world of enormous diversity and wonderful. The Indian students who come together and put on Indian dances, and the Vietnamese and the Chinese. It's just a rich kaleidoscope of humanity that is now in our midst in a really very interesting and beautiful way.
Well, that's nice. That's very encouraging. I'm down to one last question.
Okay.
And it's this. You've spent 39 years now monitoring this. You've talked about your title of your book talks about Houston, the prophetic city. So be the prophet. Stand on the mountain, be the canary in the coal mine. what is, if you had to pick one issue that you would want all of us to walk away with tonight and say, as we think ahead, to try to maximize this promise, to maximize the potential that you've outlined for us, that you believe Houston is now set up to do, what's the one issue that you would say, spend time, spend resources, spend effort on this, and if you do that, we're going to be best positioned for the next 30, 40 years? Anything come to mind?
Sure. And I think I was implicit in what I think we've been talking about. It's education. It's quality of opportunity. It's recognizing that 70% of everybody under 20 who will be us 10 and 15 years from now, 70% are African American and Latino, the two groups most likely to be living in poverty, least likely to have access to the support systems that middle class Anglos and others and middle class African Americans get. It's that combination of the deep inequalities today and the demographic transformations that make it clear, if we don't address those inequalities in this generation, for this group, for now, if we don't find a way in the next 5 or 6 years to change the trajectory for the large numbers of these kids born in poverty and locked out of opportunity, it's going to be very hard to see a Houston or an America that will succeed. So that's why I end up saying that the jury is out. And what's so interesting is that our great success in the 20th century did not demand anything of us. You were successful because you were riding the oil boom. You dug holes in the ground and they made you rich. You didn't need education to make money. You made money out of land. The big Texas fortunes came from cotton, timber, cattle, sugar, oil. The source of wealth in the 21st century will have less to do with natural resources, which was the basis for the wealth of Houston and Texas, and more to do with human resources, with knowledge and skills. And that depends on those of us who have been enormously privileged with that knowledge and those skills to ensure that those get transferred for the next generation. So it's and this is of course true for America, and Houston is there first, and we have a chance to. The other thing I say is, okay, we're not going to throw money at these problems. We don't believe in government. Let's find a way to throw people at these problems. We have enormous resources of extraordinary people many of whom are what we call the young old, age 65 or 70 to 85, who have all this energy and vitality and could do enormous help, saving one child at a time by mentoring a kid, by developing a program that can help these kids acquire the resources and the support systems that will enable them to succeed in school and acquire the skills and theoretical knowledge and technical skills that will connect them to the jobs of the 21st century. So
Amen.
Someone once said, education is not a panacea, but if we get it right, it will solve just about all of our problems. And so there's some.
To that, I'm sure we say amen. And before I turn it over to David Scott to conclude tonight, I want to also say to you, Dr. Stephen Klineberg, on behalf of all of us, I know you can't hear us, but you can see us. So I just want to say to you, on behalf of all of us, you can see all the screens, thumbs up, the cheering. Thank you very much for sharing your research, your analysis with us. We wish you many, many more years of good health, and stay at it so you can keep teaching us.
Keep it up.
And so now let me turn it back over to David Scott.
Thank you all so much for this.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you all next Thursday night, as Rabbi Lyon mentioned at the beginning, our APAC program with Elias Saratovsky and Rabbi Lyon talking about Israel. We hope to see you at all of our upcoming programs and events. Our evening is concluded. Thank you both again so much. Have a wonderful evening.
Great. Oh, let's stay some more. Okay, time to go. Thanks again for everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Klineberg.
Great to be with you. Thank you.